Okay, so let's take a real quick look at why we need to use the passive interface. With eigrp or ospf, as soon as we enable ospf on a router, or eigrp for that matter, when we add a network statement, whatever corresponding interface that network statement corresponds to, it's going to start sending hellos out. Right? So in this instance, if we were trying to get R1 and R2 to form an ospf or eigrp neighbor adjacency, we would have to add this network link in on the process for both R1 and R2. That will establish the sending of hellos out of the interface that network statement is configured on, right? So hellos will start going out. And that's what we need in order for us to actually establish the adjacency itself. So let's configure that first. So on R1, we would do, which I've already done this actually, but we're going to walk through it again. So on R1, router, ospf, process ID. Then we would do a network statement 172.16.0.0.0.0.3 area 0, because in this case we're trying to add the network segment that's the 172.16.0.0 with a /30, so we give it 172.16.0.0, and the wildcard for a /30 would be 0.0.0.3. We add that segment into area 0. When we do that on the other end with R2 as well, right? So we would come to R2 and we would do the very same thing. We would get into global config, router, OSPF, whatever process ID we want to use. Remember, this is locally significant for OSPF, so it doesn't matter as long as we use a valid number. Network 172.16.0.0, 0.0.0.3, area 0. And now when we do a show IP OSPF neighbor, you'll see that we have a neighbor formed, right? Because we're sending hellos out on this interface. Now, for R2 to be able to advertise the existence, right, if he wants to advertise to R1 the existence of this network, if he wants to advertise that over there to R1, we have to go into R2 and we have to add that network segment as well. So we would go back into router OSPF 110, and we would add a network, this time of 192.168.4.0, 0.0.0.0255, area 0, right? As soon as we do that, that begins to advertise this network with this wildcard or this range over to any of his neighbors. So in this case, R2 only has one neighbor, that's R1. But also, when we do this network statement on R2, he looks at his interfaces and he finds the interface that services this particular network segment. And in this case, it is G00 that's servicing that network segment. So as soon as we add this network statement here, what that causes OSPF to do is start sending hellos out on that segment. Well, basically it's saying, are there any OSPF routers out here that I need to form a neighbor adjacency with? And since we have no routers out here to form an adjacency with, what we need to do is suppress those hellos. We don't need to send those hellos out on that particular segment because there's no other routers out there that we want to establish an adjacency with. So if we don't put the network statement in there, we'll never advertise it to our neighbors. But if we know for sure that we don't have any neighbors out a particular interface, then we can do a passive interface on the interface, and in this case it's gigabit 00, right? And when we do that passive interface command, it suppresses those hellos going out that interface, but yet it continues to advertise that particular network out to any OSPF neighbors. So on R1, right, we would need to do the same thing. In order for our neighbor adjacency to form with the R2, we do have to put this network segment in, the 172.16.0.0, right, with a wildcard of 0003. And that will cause the hellos to begin going out of serial 000, and in that case, R1 and R2 can establish a neighbor adjacency because they're both saying hello to one another. But the same kind of scenario exists in this scenario with R1. We've got this network here, 192.168.0.0 with a 24 that we want to advertise over to R2, right? So in order for us to be able to advertise that network to R2, then we have to put it in our network statement. Network 192.168.0.0, the wildcard 000255, and into area 0. As soon as we do that, it starts advertising this network to R2, but remember, it also starts sending hellos out on that corresponding interface. And in this case, again, right, we have no routers out here on this segment. So since we have no routers out here on this segment, we need to suppress those hellos that are being sent out. And the way that we suppress those hellos is we put the passive interface command. Passive interface, and in this case it's gi0/0 again. And as soon as we do that, that suppresses the hellos, but allows that network to continue to be advertised to any ospf neighbors. This is also true for eigrp. Same process, same scenario, the same interfaces that we would wind up putting passive on. Hope this helps.